She woke to the sound of screaming, but the room was silent. Julia sat upright in her bed, heart pounding so hard it felt like her ribs might split. The scream hadn't come from outside. It had come from her. Her throat was raw, her chest trembling with the aftershock of a nightmare she couldn't fully remember. All she could cling to was the image of a woman's shadow standing at the edge of her bed watching her. For a moment, Julia couldn't move. Her brain whispered, "What if she's still here?" Her eyes darted across the room, chasing corners, shadows, the faint glow of the streetlight spilling through her blinds. Nothing, only silence. Julia pressed her hands against her temples. "It's fine. Just a dream," she whispered, as if saying it aloud could seal the truth. But deep down, she wasn't convinced. Julia wasn't the kind of woman people saw as fragile. She was 32, worked as a social worker in a small city, and had built a reputation for being strong, grounded, the one people turned to when their lives fell apart. But the truth no one knew, not her coworkers, not her closest friend Mia, not even her mother, was that Julia's own life was unraveling in quiet, invisible threads. It started weeks ago, with little things. She would forget simple tasks like where she put her car keys, or why she left the stove on when she swore she turned it off. Then came the feeling of being watched, the flicker in the corner of her eye, the sound of her name whispered in an empty room. And now, the screaming dreams. Julia tried to ignore it. She told herself it was stress, overwork, maybe too much caffeine. But tonight was different. Tonight, as she sat frozen in the dark, she noticed something chilling. The chair in the corner of her bedroom had moved. Just slightly. She remembered pushing it flush against the desk yesterday morning. Now, it sat angled, as if someone had been sitting there watching her. Her breath hitched. "No, I probably kicked it earlier, or forgot." But the words rang hollow, even to her. The next morning, Julia forced herself into routine shower, coffee, drive to work. But her reflection in the rearview mirror unsettled her. Her eyes looked tired, too wide, as though she were expecting something to leap out at her. At the office, she listened to clients pour out their pain, addiction, abuse, fear of losing custody. Julia nodded, wrote notes, offered comfort. She was good at her job. But inside, her mind was elsewhere. That chair, that shadow, that scream. At lunch, Mia slid into the seat across from her, cheerful as always. "You look like hell," she said with a smirk. Julia forced a laugh. "Thanks." "Just bad sleep. Nightmares again?" Julia stiffened. She hadn't told Mia about the nightmares. Not in detail. "Yeah, I guess." Mia studied her with concern. "You sure you're okay? You've been jumpy for weeks." "Like paranoid." Julia's chest tightened. She wanted to say yes to wave it off, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, she muttered, "Sometimes I think I'm losing it." Mia reached across the table. "Hey, you're not crazy. You're just tired, stressed. You help everyone else, but you never let anyone help you." Julia smiled weakly, but the truth clawed at her. What if it wasn't stress? What if something inside her really was slipping? That night, she tried something new. Before bed, she set up her phone on the dresser, camera facing the room. If she was imagining things, fine. But if something really was happening while she slept, she'd have proof. Sleep didn't come easy. Hours passed, her body twitching, mind replaying every sound. At last, exhaustion dragged her under. The next morning, she grabbed her phone with trembling hands. She skipped to the middle of the recording. At first, it was nothing, just her tossing, turning. Then, around 3:17 a.m., something froze her blood. The chair, the one by the desk. It slowly, quietly shifted. And Julia never moved. She dropped the phone, chest heaving. She wasn't crazy. Something was there. But worse, what she saw next made her collapse to the floor. For a brief, horrifying second, the shadow of a figure flickered across the wall behind her bed. Julia's world cracked open. She wasn't losing her mind. Something else was in her room. Something real. And it was only the beginning. Julia didn't go to work the next day. She sat at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas, staring at the phone that lay between her palms as though it might explain everything. The video was still there, sitting in her gallery like a wound she couldn't stop touching. Every time she replayed the clip, her breath came faster. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room. The chair moved again, inch by inch, slow enough that you wouldn't notice if you weren't watching carefully. And then, like a breath of fog across a mirror, the shape of a tall, thin figure passed behind her bed. Julia had always believed in logic. She dealt with people's crises, taught them to ground themselves in reality. But this wasn't something she could file neatly into the drawer labeled rational. She jumped when her phone buzzed. A text from Mia. "You didn't show up. I'm worried. Call me." Julia stared at the message, wanting to reach out but afraid of what she might say. How could she explain this without sounding unhinged? By noon, she forced herself to get dressed. The walls of her apartment felt too close, too heavy. She grabbed her jacket and the phone, stepping outside into the brittle autumn air. At the cafe, Mia was already waiting. Her smile faded as soon as she saw Julia's face. "You look worse than yesterday." "I didn't sleep," Julia admitted, sitting down. Her voice felt brittle. "Something's wrong in my apartment." Mia frowned. "What do you mean wrong?" Julia hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I recorded myself sleeping." The chair moved. On its own. And there was, her voice faltered, something in the room with me. Mia's eyes widened, but instead of disbelief, there was a quiet, unsettling seriousness in her expression. "Julia, you know I don't think you're crazy. But you have to consider maybe you're under too much stress. You've been dealing with heavy cases for months. Sleep deprivation can do things to your brain. I know what I saw," Julia said sharply, then lowered her voice, ashamed of the sudden edge. "I know how it sounds, but it's real. I felt it before I even recorded it. Like it's watching me." Mia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Okay, then we'll figure it out. Maybe set up more cameras, or," she hesitated, "talk to someone. A professional." Julia pulled her hand back, shaking her head. "I help people. I don't need help." But even as she said it, she heard the lie in her own words. That night, Julia placed not one, but 3 phones in her apartment, one in the bedroom, one in the living room, one near the front door. She double-checked the locks, closed the curtains, and sat awake on the edge of her bed until exhaustion dragged her under again. In her dream, she was standing in the same room, but the air felt thicker, like water. The shadow from the night before wasn't just watching, it was whispering. "Julia, let it in." Her eyes snapped open, heart hammering. The clock read 2:43 a.m. She could hear the hum of the heater, the distant sound of traffic. But beneath it all, there was something else, an almost inaudible creak, like weight shifting on the wooden floor outside her bedroom door. She reached for her phone, fumbling to switch on the flashlight. The door was open. She had locked it before bed. Julia's pulse roared in her ears as she crept out of bed. Step by step, she moved toward the door. She pushed it open wider with the tip of the flashlight, holding her breath. The living room was empty. The front door was still locked. But one of the phones she had left recording on the coffee table was now lying on the floor, screen cracked. She picked it up with trembling fingers. The recording was still running. She pressed play. The video showed her darkened living room. For the first few minutes, nothing. Then, at 2:36 a.m., the phone shook just slightly, as if nudged. A dark blur passed in front of the camera, too fast to make out. And then came a sound that made Julia's knees buckle, a soft, almost gentle humming. A lullaby. Her mother used to hum it to her when she was a child. Julia staggered back, phone clutched to her chest. No. The next morning, she called in sick again. She couldn't face work, couldn't pretend to be the calm professional who helped others navigate their fears. Instead, she went to see someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her older brother, Daniel. He lived 2 towns over in a small house with peeling paint and a yard full of overgrown weeds. He had once been the reckless older sibling, the one who drank too much and got into fights. But when Julia's father died, Daniel had changed, quiet, withdrawn, almost haunted. When he opened the door, his eyes widened at the sight of her. "Jules, you look." He didn't finish the sentence. "I need to talk to you," Julia said. Over mugs of black coffee at his cluttered kitchen table, she told him everything, the dreams, the shadow, the recordings. Daniel listened silently, his face pale. When she finished, he leaned back and rubbed his hands over his face. "You remember Dad's last few months?" he asked quietly. Julia frowned. "Of course I do. He was sick. Her voice trailed off. Daniel shook his head. "Not the sickness. Before that, he said he was seeing things. Said there was something in the house with him. Everyone thought it was the meds or the pain, but I saw it too, once." Julia's stomach dropped. "You're saying it's the same thing?" "I don't know," Daniel said, "but it's not just in your head. If you saw it, if you heard it, then maybe whatever haunted him didn't die with him." Julia sat frozen, staring at her coffee. The idea that something had followed their family all these years chilled her more than anything she had imagined. And for the first time since it began, she felt the cold weight of a truth she couldn't explain. Whatever was in her apartment wasn't just in her mind. It had a history, and it might not let her go. Julia sat in her brother's truck as they drove back toward her apartment. The sun had already set. A thin gray dusk clung to the streets, making the buildings seem like hollow silhouettes. She hadn't wanted to go back, but Daniel insisted they had to see for themselves. "Running won't help," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "If it's something real, we need to face it. If it's not, then you'll know." Julia hugged her arms tightly. The humming from the recording still haunted her. That lullaby wasn't just any song. It was her father's favorite when she was a child. Hearing it in the middle of the night felt like the past reaching out with cold, unseen fingers. As the truck pulled into the parking lot of her apartment building, Julia's stomach churned. The windows of her unit were dark. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead felt like the apartment was holding its breath, waiting. Inside, the place smelled faintly of dust and stale air. Daniel strode in ahead of her, flicking on the lights. "Show me the recordings," he said. She hesitated, then opened her phone and brought up the first clip, the chair moving, the shadow passing by. Daniel leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "Could be a trick of light," he said at first. But when he watched the second clip, the one with the humming, his expression hardened. "That's not wind or shadows," Julia swallowed. "You believe me now?" He didn't answer directly. "Let's check the place." They moved room by room, Daniel opening closets, peering behind doors, testing the windows. Julia stayed close, clutching her phone like a talisman. When they found nothing, Daniel sighed and said, "Maybe we should stay the night together, just in case." That night, they set up Julia's 3 phones again, angling them toward the bedroom door, the living room, and the hallway. Then they sat on the couch, lights off, listening to the soft hum of the city outside. For hours, nothing happened. The TV, muted, cast pale flickers of light across their faces. By midnight, Julia felt her eyelids grow heavy. Daniel nudged her. "Get some rest." "I'll keep watch for a while." She curled up on the couch. Sleep came in broken pieces. At some point in the early morning, she opened her eyes to find the TV off and the room bathed in blue-gray moonlight. Daniel sat in the armchair by the window, shoulders stiff, staring at the hallway. "Dan," she whispered. "Don't move," he murmured. Her heart stuttered. She followed his gaze toward the hallway. At first, there was nothing. Then she saw it, an almost imperceptible ripple of darkness, as if the shadows themselves were shifting. The apartment seemed to grow colder. The ripple thickened, stretching upward until it resembled the outline of a tall figure. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The figure tilted its head slowly, curiously, then began to recede into the hall. Daniel lunged forward, but the hallway light flickered and the shape was gone. "Did you see that?" Julia gasped. Daniel's face was pale. "Yeah, I saw it." They replayed the phone's recordings the next morning. 2 of the cameras had captured nothing unusual, but the one in the hallway. The screen showed the ripple, just as they'd seen it, lingering for several seconds before sliding out of view. There was no way to call it a trick of the light anymore. That afternoon, Daniel suggested visiting an old neighbor from their childhood, Mrs. Kessler, a woman who had lived next door to their family for decades. Julia remembered her as sharp-eyed and kind, though she'd always seemed to know more than she said. Mrs. Kessler welcomed them into her small, cluttered living room. She was older now, her hair silver, but her eyes were still bright. Julia hesitated, then told her everything. The old woman listened without interruption, then nodded slowly. "Your father spoke of it. He said he felt something was following him." I believed him. Julia's pulse quickened. What was it? Mrs. Kessler sighed. "Sometimes grief calls to the dark. Your father carried a heavy grief after your mother died. I don't know if it was real in the way you mean, or if it grew out of his sorrow, but he said it watched him. He said it wanted someone to listen." Julia frowned. "Wanted someone to listen?" The woman nodded. "Loneliness can open doors. Be careful, child. The more you notice it, the more it notices you." Back in the truck, Julia stared out the window. "So it's just grief? That's what's been haunting us?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. But at least we're not imagining it." That night, Julia returned to her apartment alone. Daniel had offered to stay, but she felt compelled to face whatever was there herself. For a while, the apartment was silent. She sat at her desk, trying to write notes for work, but her thoughts kept drifting. The humming seemed to echo faintly in her ears even when the room was quiet. Near midnight, her phone vibrated. A text. Julia let it in. No name, no number she recognized. Her blood ran cold. Hands shaking, she blocked the number, then checked the hallway camera. The feed was live but empty. She forced herself into bed, leaving a dim lamp on. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling until her eyes finally closed. When she woke, the lamp was off. The room was still dark, and she wasn't alone. A shape loomed at the edge of the bed. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The figure leaned closer, and though its face was no more than a shadow, she felt as if it were smiling. "Julia," it whispered. Then it was gone. Julia didn't remember falling asleep again after the figure whispered her name. When dawn crept through the blinds, pale and cold, she sat upright in bed as if waking from a trance. Her throat felt raw, her limbs heavy, as if she had been holding herself perfectly still for hours. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. She slid out of bed, her bare feet chilled by the floor. Her phone lay on the nightstand. She hesitated before picking it up, her thumb hovering over the gallery. She didn't want to see what might have been recorded overnight, but she had to know. Her breath caught as she pressed play. At first, it showed her asleep under the lamp's soft glow. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the lamp flickered and went out. The shadows thickened, folding around the room like water. A dark shape formed near the foot of the bed. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, until it was standing beside her sleeping figure. The screen caught the faintest motion, its head bending down as if whispering in her ear. Then her own sleeping face twitched, and her lips moved as if answering. Julia dropped the phone, her heart slamming against her ribs. The thing had spoken to her, and she had spoken back. By mid-morning, she couldn't stand the apartment any longer. She drove to Daniel's house and banged on the door. He opened it, startled at her pale face. "Jules, what happened?" "I can't stay there," she said hoarsely. "It talked to me. I think I answered it." Daniel guided her inside and sat her down. She told him everything while he listened, grim-faced. When she finished, he said quietly, "It wants something." It always did. Dad said the same, that it whispered to him, wanted him to listen. Maybe it feeds on grief, on loneliness. "We have to end this, Jules." "How?" she asked. He didn't have an answer. That afternoon, Daniel called Mrs. Kessler and asked if she would come over. She arrived with a faded shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes softened when she saw Julia. "I told you," she said gently. "The more you pay attention to it, the stronger it becomes. You have to close the door you opened." "I didn't open anything," Julia said sharply. "I just recorded it." Mrs. Kessler shook her head. "Sometimes noticing is enough. You saw it, you feared it, and fear is a door." Julia buried her face in her hands. "I don't even know what it wants." The old woman hesitated, then said, "Maybe you should ask it." Julia stared at her. "You want me to talk to it?" "Not in anger," the woman said. "Not in fear. Just listen, and then let it go." That evening, Julia and Daniel returned to the apartment. The place felt even heavier now, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. They turned off the lights, leaving only the hallway lamp glowing faintly. Julia sat on the edge of her bed, Daniel beside her. The old woman waited in the living room, murmuring softly as if in prayer. Hours passed. The city's night sounds came and went. Then the lamp flickered. Julia's breath hitched. She felt the air shift, the room cooling as if a window had opened. Slowly, she looked toward the foot of the bed. It was there. The shape stood still, as if waiting. Julia's hands trembled, but she remembered Mrs. Kessler's words. She forced herself to speak, her voice low and unsteady. "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a whisper soft, almost sorrowful, "Not to be alone." The words chilled her more than any threat could have. "You can't stay here," she whispered back. "You can't have me." The shape tilted its head, then slowly began to recede toward the hallway. The lamp flickered again, casting its shadow long and thin across the wall, until it finally dissolved into the dark. Julia's whole body sagged with relief, but she knew it wasn't over. Not entirely. The next morning, she packed a bag and locked the apartment behind her. She moved in with Daniel for the time being. The recording stayed on her phone, untouched, like scars she wasn't ready to delete. In the following weeks, Julia started therapy. She spoke about the grief she had carried since their father's death, about the way her loneliness had quietly grown roots in the dark corners of her mind. The humming didn't return. Neither did the shadow. But sometimes, late at night, Julia would lie awake in the quiet of Daniel's guest room and wonder if it had truly left, or if it still lingered, waiting for another crack in the door. For the first time in years, she wasn't pretending to be invincible. She let herself grieve, let herself accept help. The fear had taught her that even the strongest people need others to lean on. One evening Mia visited. The three of them sat on the porch as the sun sank low, casting a gentle orange glow. "You're starting to look like yourself again," Mia said with a small smile. Julia nodded. "I'm trying." She hesitated, then added softly, "I don't think the darkness was just a thing. I think it was part of me too." The part one kept ignoring. Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're not alone in this anymore." Julia looked at the horizon, where the sky was darkening but not yet night. For the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet, fragile hope. The darkness might never vanish entirely, but it no longer had her.